I am Ryan McKnight, and this is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 68 of the Naked Mormonism podcast. This is the Serial Mormon History Podcast. Today is Thursday, September 14th, 2017. My name is Bryce Blankenegel, and thank you for joining me. On this episode, we jump right into adding an incredible well of depth to the character of Joseph Smith by reading a number of extracts from William Morain's The Sword of Laban, Joseph Smith and the Dissociated Mind. The excruciating pain from his childhood leg surgery, coupled with the death of his eldest brother in his late teens, had significant impacts on Joe's psyche, baggage that he would carry for the rest of his life. Maybe we can understand the inner workings of a broken mind by viewing decisions Joe made through a child's eyes. Joe then goes on to call the Quorum of the 12 Apostles home from their mission in England, but he also permits Parley P. Pratt, P cubed as we know him, to tarry a little bit longer so he can continue his publishing duties with the Liverpool Book of Mormon as well as the Millennial Star. The economic outlook for Nauvoo looked good on the surface at the end of 1840, but the whole thing was built on credit, and there was a jobs vacuum affecting every Mormon who chose to settle roundabout. After that, we invite recurring correspondent Ryan McKnight on for a Mormon Leaks Minute before dealing with a little bit of listener feedback. Let's boot up the episode today with a little bit of milk to tickle our appetite. Last week's episode was all about shifting perspective. We began with discussing John C. Bennett's address to the Mormon leadership during the October 1840 conference and how his soapboxing likely cast him into the in-group of trusted Mormon leadership. One of his important provisions to be adopted into the Nauvoo public policy was that 2 or 3 witnesses were required before a person could be convicted of a crime, which introduces all sorts of problems, especially when it came to Broket's incredibly active and admittedly predatory sex life. After that, we invited Marie Kent, my co-host from the My Book of Mormon podcast, on to discuss what abortion was like in the 19th century, in addition to a number of other women's rights issues. Women having children out of wedlock was essentially a sentence to utter destitution or death if they didn't have a support system to get them through life. Let's just say I'm glad to be living in the 21st century. All right, our thirst for milk has all but expired, but our hunger for meat overwhelms. Let's get into it.
As the scriptures say, they must have milk before meat.
What is it that gives us motivation? What is it that takes motivation away? Now, this is a complex psychological exercise, trying to figure out our own motivations. What am I going to eat for breakfast this morning? Now, trying to ascertain the motives for why a person chooses eggs and toast over cereal is surprisingly complex, and those are only motivations which work within incredibly constrained parameters. Now, it's hard for a person to choose to have a genuine Maine lobster for breakfast when they don't really have access to the needed materials to make it happen. So a person can be motivated to have that Maine lobster for breakfast, but their decision is limited to what is reasonable, given the limited choices available to them when they wake up in the morning. If you want an explanation for why I chose to eat cereal this morning, speculating on my motives would be based on who you ask. If you ask Freud, he might say that it's because my dad always fed me pancakes as a kid. Ask a behavioral psychologist, and they might say that it's because I had success every day that I had eaten cereal, whereas every day that started with eggs and toast usually ended in disaster, so I chose cereal. If you ask a comparative psychologist, she might say that I went for food source which was easiest to attain with the least expended calories. If you ask a social psychologist, and he may say that I chose cereal because it's what the majority of my peers eat for breakfast, and I don't want to be an outcast. Ask a forensic psychologist, and they may tell you that once I read an article that serial killers frequently eat eggs and toast for breakfast, and I'm not a serial killer, so I'm predisposed to choose the cereal. The truth of the matter is, none of those explanations is fully accurate as to why I was motivated to choose cereal for breakfast this morning. And all of those subtle influences may have played a small part, but if you ask me why I chose cereal, I'll just tell you it's because I felt like having cereal that morning. The psychologists are there to analyze why I felt like eating cereal, but the personal answer would be much more simplistic on the face than any explanation these fields of psychology could offer. Unfortunately, though, those explanations for motivation can be incredibly complex, and each one may be only partially correct. And that's with a decision as simple as what to eat for breakfast in the morning. If somebody were looking back on my life from 200 years in the future and trying to ascribe motivations for why I chose cereal on this specific September morning, they would be at incredible pains to try and explain it. And they wouldn't even have the luxury of personally asking me why cereal instead of eggs and toast. This is a common historical roadblock that we consistently run into when trying to judge Joseph Smith and his motives for any given decision throughout his life. Humans are incredibly complex problems to attempt any deconstruction, which is why labels usually ascribed to Joe are woefully inadequate to explain his life. Was he a prophet? Was he a fraud? Was he motivated solely by testosterone, which frequently got out of hand bordering on pedophilia? Was he sincere in his beliefs, but utterly misled by the learned folk of his day? Was he what he claimed he was? We can sit back and psychoanalyze Joe's decisions till we're blue in the balls, but no matter how deep we dig, we'll never understand the full truth or be able to manufacture a box big enough in which to fit the real Joe Smith. That being said, psychoanalyzing Joe isn't an exercise in futility. The more we understand his complex brain, the more we can see how naturalistic pressures led him to do any given thing he did. And there's less room for God to fit in his motivations when we have naturalistic explanations. So let me cue you into why I'm bringing up this topic. I've recently been reading through a book by William D. Morain, a surgeon, doctor, titled The Sword of Laban, Joseph Smith and the Dissociated Mind. It's available at a fine retailer near you. William Morain is a reconstructive surgeon who's had decades of experience in caring for patients who've undergone horrific experiences requiring major reconstructive surgery. In doing so, he's become incredibly familiar with the psychology of trauma and how it affects people, especially children. He relates a number of personal experiences where he had to unwrap and rewrap dressings on burned children, burn victims and stuff, and he's seen firsthand what the pain does to them and how their brains engage certain survival mechanisms to deal with the pain. He discusses one prominent survival mechanism known as dissociation, where the individual's mind essentially disconnects and goes elsewhere while their body remains and deals with the pain of the situation. Those experiences consequently become locked behind psychological barriers in their mind, where they usually don't remember actually experiencing the pain, but they do remember that the occurrence happened. Children in a dissociated state of mind experience all sorts of weird phenomenon as manifestations of this dissociation that sort of make themselves apparent. According to Dr. Morain, during this survival mechanism, they frequently regress to younger states of mind, becoming incapable of understanding their own reality or what's going on, or even identifying the people in the room around them, often becoming incontinent in the process and lashing out at their parents, who are in no way responsible for the pain that the child is experiencing, and a number of incredible other things. Only halfway through this book, I'm gaining a massive respect for doctors who see stuff like this day in and day out and still somehow get up for work every day to do it all over again. So I want to share a few excerpts from this book, as I think it lays an interesting psychological foundation on which Joseph Smith constructed his empire. This is from the preface of the book, and once again, this is William D. Morain's The Sword of Laban, Joseph Smith Jr. and the Dissociated Mind. Quote, Bettelheim, a psychoanalyst with special interest in children, made convincing case that fairy tales help a child to experience the common mortal fears shared by all his or her peers by allowing him or her to express those fears in a world of imagination. Thus, those unspeakably threatening fantasies already lurking in Peter's, that's Dr. Morain's son, mind may be shared with simpletons, giants, and princesses in ways that assure him that the world has a sense of order and fairness. His rapt attention has been such confirmation for me of Bettelheim's wisdom that I have made certain that a different fairy tale is served up at each bedtime. End quote. Then he goes on to relate an interesting observation. Well, actually, a few observations. I'm going to share a couple of them with you here. And he discusses the things that he's experienced in the clinic. Quote, child psychiatrist Lenore Terr has written, quoting Terr, quote, a whole life can be shaped by an old trauma, remembered or not. Now it goes back to Morain. I recall the 45-year-old carnival roustabout who was burned over 40% of his body when his mobile home furnace exploded. His repeated dressing changes in the large tub were as painful as expected. However, he soon became unusually fearful and tremulous whenever I entered the room, but not when the nurses or the more junior members of the surgical team approached him. His exaggerated submissiveness and fear toward me apparently had some hidden explanation. One Saturday morning, I put my feet up to have a more leisurely conversation with him, steering the conversation from his immediate family to his childhood. I asked as casually as I could about his father. The tears broke quickly. This paragon of machismo melted into the sad child he really was, as he poured out a story of physical beatings and abuse that continued to torture him long after he had escaped the blows by running away from home to join the circus. Being placed in a submissive and powerless role again by a man who inflicted pain brought back the original emotions and the behavior he had spent the rest of his life trying to expunge through bravado. Now he continues on later. There was a woman in her 50s with horrible bed sores who clutched her teddy bear to her cheek and sobbed bitterly whenever we discussed plans for her treatment. As I knew she had successfully raised a large family before a mishap had taken away the feeling and use of her legs, I directed our conversation towards illness she might have had as a child. I learned between her sobs that she had burned her feet severely while walking barefoot through a dump at the age of 8. She had been unable to find a way out of the smoldering embers left by a rubbish fire. There followed weeks of painful treatment in the hospital at the time. Now, once more, she became the same 8-year-old she had been nearly 5 decades earlier. End quote. This is just out of the preface, and these are merely anecdotal evidences of the phenomenon of dissociated mind disorder. The people that Morain provides as examples underwent incredible traumas at a very young age, with their minds dissociating as a survival mechanism, and it took a traumatic experience later in their lives to unlock those memories, which almost regressed their minds to the mindset they had when the young age trauma occurred. Any of you who know the history of Joseph Smith know where I'm going with this, and that's exactly where William Morain goes in the first 3 chapters of his book. I'm going to read a few excerpts out of this, and I'm getting at a much larger overall point, but let's get there together. Don't quite get ahead of me here. What I'm about to read to you offers some interesting context to who Joseph Smith really was, and some of the psychological dynamics which has causal impact on his motivations at some level. Once again, out of The Sword of Laban, Joseph Smith Jr. and the Dissociated Mind. Please read this book. I'm coming to appreciate a whole new side of Joseph Smith that I've never had before. Quote, there are some additional assumptions that may be properly made. Joseph Jr. must have been caught up in the pecking order of sibling politics in the rivalry over scarce provisions and personal attention in the teeming Smith household. He might have harbored some jealousy, as well as awe and affection for his older brothers Alvin and Hiram in particular. But his social aspirations in early life should hardly have extended much further than gaining preferential favor with his parents among his several siblings. The pivotal event in Joseph Smith's life that seems, at least in substantial part, to have profoundly altered his personality occurred shortly after his 7th birthday. And then after that, Morain goes on to tell of the typhoid fever, which overran the Smith home, infecting every one of the children. Joe was infected, and the infection caused the lymph node under his left arm to swell up, and it required lancing to discharge the fluids. Soon after this successful procedure, the infection moved down to his left leg. The surgeons performed 3 separate surgeries to remove the infection, with the third surgery including removal of actual infected bone tissue, which Dr. Morain gives in explicit detail. Quote, "There was to be a second complication, however. The Salmonella typhi bacteria had already spread through his bloodstream to the upper portion of his left tibia, the shin bone, where the marrow was being replaced by a second abscess. As is the natural history of this condition, called osteomyelitis, the abscess expanded to involve the layer of tissue just beneath the periosteum, the nourishing membrane ensheathing the bone. This nerve-rich sheath was expanded by the growing pocket of pus, and this expansion caused pain greater than any he had ever experienced. Indeed, it is widely reported that periosteal pain is more severe than that of any other tissue. The intervening bone on the front surface of Joseph's tibia was deprived of its blood supply and died. Pus produced a massive swelling on the front of his leg. The most painful stage of the illness lasted a full 2 weeks. Any 7-year-old would have found such a noxious event to be terribly frightening and excruciating." End quote. Then it goes on to give Lucy and Joe's account of the infection, but the passage that Dr. Morain writes afterward is important to understand the psychological dynamics at play during this very fragile time in Joseph's young mind. Quote, "Now for a short period, perhaps one of few in his young life, Joseph Smith Jr. appeared to have been permitted the sole nurturing attention of his mother. As it had with the oldest daughter, all of the powerful mixture of maternal emotions induced by her child's illness rallied Lucy's attention now to the cause of her middle son. He was suffering and in mortal danger, but even this protective, grieving mother was not omnipotent." Then he goes on to quote Lucy's memoir, Biographical Sketches of the Prophet Joseph Smith. Quote, "During this period, I carried him much of the time in my arms in order to mitigate his suffering as much as possible, in consequence of which I was taken very ill myself. The anxiety of mind that I experienced, together with my physical overexertion, was too much for my constitution, and my nature sank under it." Back to Dr. Morain. From Joseph's vantage point, however, the admitted failure of his mother's nurturing at this point of crisis must have been dreadful. It is reasonable to assume that the 7-year-old perceived his mother's actions as a rejection and betrayal at best, or some form of punishment at worst. His age-specific powerful affection for his mother, once all but realized at the moment of his greatest physical pain, could not have been relinquished without enormous disappointment. We're going to keep reading from this, a fair number of excerpts more, because I have to say, it's just, like I said, it's offered so much context into the mind of Joseph Smith, and I'm gaining a new perspective and a new appreciation for him. Continuing on. "One can scarcely imagine Joseph's state of fear during those days and nights as the pain in his leg returned in ever-increasing intensity. He knew the surgeon would certainly have to return to slash again at the open wound whose swollen edges had become so tender they could not even bear the gentlest touch. His mother had abandoned him. He had barely slept in weeks because of the pain and nightmares, and the sight and smell of the oozing mess that used to be his left leg would have repulsed any 7-year-old into a state of panic. Fear had by now certainly driven rational understanding of these terrible events from the child's mind. The repressed fears would likely have been erupting with waves of terror as fantasy and reality converged in the sleep-deprived chaos of his psyche. Something inside him, something of which he, at age 7, was but vaguely aware, must have known his father's companions could exact the ultimate punishment. His assaulted leg at some level of consciousness would become a powerful symbol for the terrible conflict of childhood fantasy that he would never resolve. Had they come to cut it off? End quote. And if you ever wonder where the vivid hallucinations of angels wielding swords of fire in Joe's later years found their genesis, look no further than the operation itself. Disclaimer, if this hasn't already made you ill hearing this, This is where we really get into some details, and Dr. Morain describes this procedure as he's seen it in the past, and he gives a very disconnected clinical approach of this procedure, and it's a little bit graphic, so listener discretion advised for the next few minutes. Quote, "The instrument case was reopened. Joseph would have dreaded viewing its contents once again. The chief surgeon, Nathan Smith, always brought the complete set. Most of all, Joseph would have feared the amputation knife, that foot-long, sword-like instrument whose design had not appreciably changed in the hundreds of years since the primitive barber surgeons. Most surgical instrument kits carried 2 or even 3. That sword, its pain and its ultimate purpose, had haunted his dreams and daytime fantasies, since it had been first and for a second time plunged into his leg. The sword would not cease occupying those fantasies ever. The swollen, pus-filled tissues were cleaved once again." Side note, this was the 3rd time that they had to cut into his leg, and that's when the 3rd time they actually scraped away bone tissue. "The sensitive periosteum was stripped. The trephine was filled and twisted into the bone. The largest chunk of dead bone was pried free with a hook. Blood poured after it. Forceps grabbed smaller chunks and forcefully dislodged them from the fresh edges of sensitive living tissue. Saws cut through the margins. The geyser of blood was stemmed with cloth packing, and then it was over. Joseph's leg would one day heal. His psyche would not." End quote. Now, you may wonder why I decided to include so much of Dr. Morain's work just to start out the discussion today. Well, it has much to do with how this childhood trauma inflicted unseen wounds on the young Joe's fragile mind. This is the penultimate passage that I'll read to get to the broader point of today's show. Quote, "As a surgeon, this author can say that Lucy's description of Joseph's behavior," now, preface, that is when Joseph said, "Mother, you can't be here. I will not take 1 drop of alcohol." And he was very cool and calculated at the age of 7. So that's the behavior that Dr. Morain is describing. Once again, this author can say that Lucy's description of Joseph's behavior is so atypical of a 7-year-old boy facing a surgical assault that one is tempted to dismiss the entire narrative out of hand. However, it is possible that her portrayal of Joseph as a brave victim may have had a grain of validity, but only under a very special condition. It is typical of children who suffer repeated bouts of terrible trauma that they may enter a kind of trance or self-hypnosis that protects against the emotional experience of the horror. A kind of depersonalization supervenes so that the event is experienced as though it were being viewed from the outside. Lucy's narrative suggests that this may have been Joseph's maiden voyage into dissociation. There would be many more." End quote. After that, it tells of Joe being sent to live with his uncle Jesse in Salem, Massachusetts as soon as he was healthy enough to walk. Likely a reprieve from his parents and a break for his parents from him. So now onto the final passage that we're going to read from Dr. Morain's book today. Quote, "It was probably in his exile at the seashore that the fantasies began, projected from within by an unspeakable horror he could not recall. As will be seen, these included huge, violent fantasies. Fantasies of war. Fantasies of people in chaos who escaped to the seashore. Fantasies of magic swords that dismember heads and arms. Fantasies of sons overthrowing fathers, princes killing kings, righteous killing unrighteous. Fantasies of towers, trees, serpents, flaming swords, pillars, cigar-shaped boats, sickles, and stiff-necked people. Fantasies of evil men brought to humiliation by young heroes. Fantasies of good fathers and evil fathers. Of faithful women and whores. Fantasies of good armies and bad armies pushing one another to and fro like battles of ants. Fantasies of betrayal, of darkness, of magic stones that light up the darkness. Fantasies of good white people and evil black people, of good white people becoming evil black people. Fantasies of princes being bound with cords, of blood on garments, of maggots eating flesh. Fantasies of destroying angels with drawn swords. The fantasies would flood out of his unconscious in hundreds of repetitive dreams and nightmares, in daydreams, in random sequences, in play, in speech, and in silence. They took over the inner life of Joseph Smith, as an automatic pilot takes over an aircraft. In this state, he limped into his future. End quote. This episode isn't just a book report on the first few chapters of The Sword of Laban by Dr. William Morain. I read so much of it because it strikes me as a fundamental piece of the prophet puzzle we need to understand Joseph Smith in proper context. While Dr. Morain goes on to describe that Joe's trance-like state was the catalyst for how he was able to automatically write the Book of Mormon, with Precious and Mr. Hat as the physical items which cast him into this self-hypnotic state, the deeper implications of this mental damage wrought on his young mind had effects for the rest of his life. Reality didn't seem to mean much to Joe. He saw everything in very simplistic good and evil terms with simplistic consequences and very simple heroes and villains. Throughout his many years, Joe had a major problem with authoritarian figures, and they often represented his greatest personal foes during all of his years, but especially once his life came into the limelight of social prominence. Now, personally, I think this purview into Joe's psyche offers some interesting context and reasoning behind his violent rhetoric against those damned mobocrats which were always trying to arrest or kill him. But the case shouldn't be made that he was consciously thinking of his dad and his team of doctors pinning him down and inflicting grievous wounds whenever he was preaching this violent rhetoric from the pulpit. The psychological wounds were much deeper than met the eye, which fundamentally altered his mindset and outlook on life. This confrontation Joe had with death at such an early age caused him to see every person as either ally or foe, friend or enemy, someone who was out to help him or someone who was there to hurt him. It eviscerated any nuance his mind might be able to see in the near future and served to be one of his greatest weaknesses, but also one of his charismatic features. When we only see black and white, the colorful world and the colorful folk populating it shrink to two dimensions, and all nuanced perspective is utterly lost. In December of 1840, Joe penned a long-awaited letter to the Quorum of the 12 in England. There's a passage in it which shows Joe's dichotomous mindset of good and evil with no nuance fitting in between the two. This is from the Dan Vogel History of the Church, Volume 4, page 223. From a letter written by Joseph Smith. Quote, "There are many things of much importance on which you ask counsel, but which I think you will be perfectly able to decide upon, as you are more conversant with the peculiar circumstances than I am, and I feel great confidence in your united wisdom. Therefore you will excuse me for not entering into detail. If I should see anything that is wrong, I should take the privilege of making my own mind known to you, and pointing out the evil of it." End quote. Not pointing out the inaccuracies and not pointing out the mistakes, but pointing out the evil of it. If people were aligned with Joe's will, they were good. If they somehow fell into conflict with what he wanted, the actions and usually the person were branded as resoundingly evil. However, Joe does actually handle a few other important pieces of business in the same letter, and we're going to read a few more excerpts to bring in a few more points about motivations and what caused Joe to do or not to do what he did or didn't do. Quoting from further in the letter, quote, "In my former epistle, I told you my mind respecting the printing of the Book of Mormon, hymn book, etc. I have been favored by receiving a hymn book from you, and as far as I have examined it, I highly approve of it, and I think it to be a very valuable collection. I am informed that the Book of Mormon is likewise printed, which I am glad to hear, and should be pleased to hear that it was printed in all the different languages of the earth. You can use your own pleasure respecting the printing of the Doctrine and Covenants. If there is a great demand for them, I have no objections, but would rather encourage it." End quote. So the Quorum of the 12, still in England at this time, got Joe's stamp of approval for the Liverpool hymn book and Book of Mormon to be distributed as soon as could be handled. The English converts were populous and hungry for Mormon publications, and it took too long and cost too much money to ship them materials that were printed in Nauvoo. Thus, the Quorum did something good in Joe's mind. This is convenient because earlier in the letter, Joe called the Quorum home. Quote, "Being requested to give my advice respecting the propriety of your returning in the spring, I will do so willingly. I have reflected on the subject for some time, and am of the opinion that it would be wisdom in you to make preparations to leave the scene of your labors in the spring. Having carried the testimony to that land, and numbers having received it, the leaven can now spread without your being obliged to stay. Another thing, there have been whisperings of the Spirit that there will be some agitations, excitements, and trouble in the land in which you are now laboring. I would therefore say, in the meantime, be diligent, organize the churches, and let everyone stand in his proper place, so that those who cannot come with you in the spring may not be left as sheep without a shepherd." End quote. But not all business was handled, as it would be necessary to leave a few of the brethren in England to perpetuate the church there, and make sure that the church members who were recently converted in England didn't fall astray, as had so many congregations after baptism and abandonment by their baptizing elder. Quote, "If Elder Parley P. Pratt should wish to remain in England some time longer than the rest of the 12, he will feel himself at liberty to do so, as his family are with him. Consequently, his circumstances are somewhat different than the rest. And likewise, it is necessary that someone should remain who is conversant with the rules and the regulations of the church, and continue the paper which is published. Consequently, taking all these things into consideration, I would not press it upon Brother Pratt to return in the spring." End quote. Now, he's referring to the spring of 1841. Now, that was kind of the point of this letter. He was saying, yeah, you guys have done a good job. Come back to America in spring of 41. But leave Parley P. Pratt there. So Pratt would end up remaining in England and continue directing the church and sending convert immigrants to America until about November of 1842. Here's a quick extract from P. Cube's autobiography describing the conclusion of his mission in England. He was quite proud of the Millennial Star that he'd been publishing for over 2 years from Liverpool up to this point. Check the show notes for a link to the autobiography of Parley P. Pratt. Quoting from P. Cubed, quote, "Being about to return to America, I published in the October number of the Star, 1842, my farewell address, from which I here give a few extracts." And the article is titled, "Farewell Address to Our Readers and Patrons. Brethren and friends, as I am about to take leave of the Star and give it to the management of others, I feel it necessary to make a few remarks suited to the occasion. This publication was undertaken 2 years and 6 months since. Since that time, I have labored diligently, as far as pressure of other duties would admit, to render it a useful and interesting periodical. I have published the Principles of the Latter-day Saints, together with a choice selection of the most interesting items of news in relation to the progress of these principles among men. I have also endeavored at all times to defend the cause of truth, and to ward off the arrows of envy and slander which have been hurled at the children of light by the strong arm of thousands who speak evil of things they understand not. I feel great satisfaction in a review of my editorial course. I feel my conscience clear, and a secret whispering within, that I have done my duty faithfully before God. I also feel to rejoice in the success which has attended the efforts of the servant of God in this country, in the publication of truth. At the commencement of the Star, the saints in Europe numbered less than 2,000. They now number near 10,000, besides thousands who have emigrated to a distant land. This, surely, is a great triumph of truth, when we take into consideration the prejudice and opposition which we have had to encounter. Surely the Millennial Star has stood forth as a beacon on a hill, as a lonely lamp amid surrounding darkness, to light the weary pilgrim on his toilsome journey, and to kindle up the dawn of a day of glory, when the effulgent beams of the sun of righteousness shall shine forth as the morning, and dispel the misty vapors which, like a gloomy cloud, have for ages hovered over the pathways of mortals." End quote. So thanks to the efforts of P. Cubed, Parley P. Pratt, the missionary efforts in England continued to perpetuate. And just to let you know, the numbers that he gave are wildly exaggerated, but I guess that's kind of an ancillary point, not really that interesting, but it's still worth mentioning. So let's get back to the letter that Joe wrote to the Quorum of the 12, because we just took that tangent very briefly to discuss what Parley P. Pratt would be doing at this time while the Quorum were making their way back to Nauvoo. Now back to Joseph's letter from the History of the Church, Dan Vogel edition, Volume 4. Quote, "I am happy to inform you that we are prospering in this place," and that's Nauvoo that he's talking about, "and that the saints are more healthy than formerly. And from the decrease of sickness this season, when compared with the last, I am led to the conclusion that this must eventually become a healthy place. There are at present about 3,000 inhabitants of Nauvoo, and numbers are flocking in daily. Provisions are much lower than when you left. Lower in price, that's what he means. Flour is about $4 per barrel. Corn and potatoes about 25 cents per bushel, and other things in proportion. There has been a very plentiful harvest throughout the Union. You will observe by the times and seasons that we are about building a temple. Another fucking temple. For the worship of our God in this place. Preparations are now making. Every 10th day is devoted by the brethren for quarrying rock, etc. We have secured one of the most lovely situations for it in the region of this country. It is expected to be considerably larger than the one at Curland, and on a more magnificent scale, and cost 10 times more, I bet, and which will undoubtedly attract the attention of the great men of the earth." End quote. So this passage, stand alone, seems to paint a very optimistic picture for the progress of the saints in Nauvoo, but a number of major problems existed which required a nuanced and pragmatic approach to economics, which Joe's childlike mind was woefully unable to bring to the table. Now contrast that previous passage we just read with this passage from earlier in the letter. Quote, "I would likewise observe that inasmuch as this place has been appointed for the gathering of the saints, it is necessary that it should be attended to in the order that the Lord intends it should. To this end, I would say that there are great numbers of the saints in England who are extremely poor and not accustomed to the farming business, who must have certain preparations made for them before they can support themselves in this country. Therefore, to prevent confusion and disappointment when they arrive here, let those men who are accustomed to make machinery and those who can command a capital, though it be small, come here as soon as convenient and put up machinery, and make such other preparations as may be necessary, so that when the poor come on, they may have employment to come to. This place has advantages for manufacturing and commercial purposes, which but very few can boast of, and the establishing of cotton factories, foundries, potteries, etc. would be the means of bringing in wealth and raising it to a very important elevation. I need not occupy more space on the subject, as it's reasonable as must be obvious to every mind." End quote. So once again, we see not really a revelation, but a letter explicitly dictating the Quorum of the 12 to send the rich Europeans over who can command capital, who can build factories and machinery, but all of the poor people, we'll just wait for them because we have too many people here who need a job and not enough jobs for those people to fill. So on the one hand, Nauvoo was beginning to prosper by the winter of 1840, but on the other hand, nobody really had any jobs other than just farming their own plots for a meager amount of food to sustain the people of Nauvoo. Hardly any crops were being harvested for major export operations, as the land had yet to be cultivated to an industrial scale. But the economics of Nauvoo required a conservative hand with some knowledge of economics. Joe had neither of those attributes. He was motivated by a relentless desire to raise up a city of followers which looked to him as the answer man and prophet in chief. What this amounted to was the entirety of Nauvoo being built on nothing more than credit, with a chief export of crippling debt. Joe was being presented with so many contracts which would serve to build up the kingdom, but the capital that the church could throw around was nothing more than an empty paper bag. Joe and the church were shouldering tens of thousands of dollars in debt, and the Mormons were buying property from the church, but not at rates high enough to pay off the debts. They were barely even able to pay the interest on the debts. This problem was deeper perpetuated by the fact that Nauvoo was nothing before the saints got there, and it takes years to build up the infrastructure of a city with enough industrial exports to match the resource demands of the population. Robert Flanders' book, Nauvoo, Kingdom on the Mississippi, does a really great job of showing just how in-demand business was in Nauvoo's early years. There was a labor vacuum. There were too many skilled workers in a sprawling metropolis without any jobs to offer. This is from page 147 of his book. Quote, "Nauvoo needed industry. Almost everyone who commented on the economy or was responsible for its welfare agreed upon the need. However, industrializing Nauvoo was more typically the concern of the labor seeking employment, the church official worried about jobs for the poor, or the consumer anxious about the high cost of imported manufactures, than it was for the profit-seeking capitalist entrepreneur, of whom there were relatively few. The kind of workers, cooperative, self-sufficient, moneyless economy that budded in Nauvoo and blossomed in Utah was a natural result. Continuing from later on, many English immigrants were experienced factory workers, including weavers and other textile laborers, bootmakers, potters, and carriage makers. They naturally urged the creation of manufactories in Nauvoo. Francis Moon wrote home in 1840, now quoting Francis Moon's letter, quote, "We have no factory as yet, but we want means to build corn mills, and not having much machinery, we have to do at home what would be done at factories if we had them. What we want is some persons with property for to raise these places, and then the clothing would be at a less rate, and we English would feel more at home. But after all, this is a new country." And back to Robert Flanders' book, quote, "Weaving enterprises would keep in Nauvoo the money spent for clothing, and also furnish many with employment who are better acquainted with weaving than any other work. Joseph Fielding noted in addition that several have done well at shopkeeping, and it is likely to be a good business. Farming is also important, as all we get out of the earth has not to be purchased from the world." John Needham wrote in the summer of 1843, now quoting John Needham, quote, "With regard to the laboring people here, we want someone with money to raise a factory or more. We then could employ many idle hands, and many who go to the neighboring towns and states. This is caused by the often flush of immigrants, both from the eastern states and from England. It would be a great thing for this place to have manufactories of different kinds, but time and perseverance and faithfulness before the Lord will bring about a good deal." Now finishing with Flanders, no one was more anxious for industry or enthusiastic about its benefit than Joseph Smith. End quote. One need look no further than the Book of Mormon to see Joe's childish and naive approach to economics and morality. One of the central tenets taught multiple times throughout the Book of Mormon is that the rich should be charitable by giving all of their money to the poor, and that the totally righteous rich people are blessed by the Lord until they become too rich. Then they're totally evil, deserving of some kind of violent humbling, usually at the hands of the totally wicked, dark-skinned Lamanites. That's not how anything in the world works. Joe had a worthlessly childish view on how to build a city and what an insurmountable perpetual deficit could do to a city the size of Nauvoo. And I guess that brings us back to the original point. What motivated Joseph Smith? I mean, Joe was probably motivated by very simplistic notions of whatever he considered good, and by extension, he disliked anything that he perceived as evil, this dichotomous bipolar approach. Unfortunately, the world is constructed with shades of gray. Anything Joe sought that would help build up the kingdom on the Mississippi, he considered righteous, and it was approved of the Lord. So when self-interested people would approach Joe with a venomous contract which would, in effect build up the city, but drive him and the church hopelessly further into debt, Joe was motivated to sign the contract with little negotiation because he was in the pursuit of a righteous goal. And this was something that was deemed righteous by God. What could possibly go wrong with that? But viewing everything through the eyes of purely good and purely evil can cause people like Joe to rationalize whatever makes them feel good as being the will of God. While his motives of pursuing whatever God dictates may have been pure, it doesn't make his decisions any less damaging or wholly stupid when everything comes out in the aggregate. What motivated Joseph Smith? If I had to hedge a guess at this, I would say that it was an honest and sincere desire to fulfill the will of whatever God lived in his mind, whatever the voices inside his head were telling him to do. However, in spite of what the world around him thought and how we judge Joe looking back on his actions, it almost seemed like he could make that God say whatever he wanted most in life. It was like, Jack Sparrow's compass. But, that's just my guess. The truth of the matter is, Joe marched to the beat of a different drum than most of his contemporaries. And just like we can never truly know why I was motivated to eat cereal this morning for breakfast, we can never truly know what it was that actually motivated Joe to become such an anomaly in American history.
I'm Ryan McKnight, and welcome to the Mormon Leaks Minute.
So many answers and assurances can come through daily searching and studying the scriptures, and with sincere and pleading prayer. But there are no such promises on the internet.
Welcome, everybody, to a Mormon Leaks Minute. And Ryan, thank you for joining me, man. Pleasure to talk to you today.
Hey, Bryce, it's always good to be here.
Awesome, man. Well, we have a ton to talk about today. This video, let's start out with talking about a video that was recently released. This was with a BYU football player, Francis Bernard. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Yep.
And why don't you just tell everybody what this video was about?
Well, the video itself basically was the majority of it is a black screen with only audio, and then there's some visual in the last 30 seconds or so. And it was filmed on December 4th, 2016. And it was, Mr. Bernard was having a party, with a bunch of girls and alcohol, and it was going past curfew, and it was loud. The police were called. They tried to break up the party, tell everybody to go home. The police left, and then they didn't break up the party. And so now the police are back for the second time. And that is what our video is of, the second visit from the police. And you hear the police interacting with Mr. Bernard, whose house it is, or whose apartment it is, I should say. And they're going to give him a ticket. They're wanting to give him a ticket for, they don't really say exactly what it's for, but it's, the way they're talking, it sounds like it's probably going to be for disorderly conduct or some sort of a nuisance, some sort of a nuisance charge. And, Bernard does not want the ticket. He's trying to convince them not to give him the ticket through various different means of persuasion. And, the one of the interesting parts that a lot of people found with the video during this part of the exchange is the Provo police, who are not officially part of BYU or anything, referencing the fact that, they're trying to hook him up by giving him just a ticket as opposed to something worse that could get him in trouble with the honor code. And so they kind of invoke the honor code.
The cop says, "What about the honor code, dude?" He says it explicitly. And that's kind of where the controversy comes in, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, that is, obviously to the average viewer of the video, most latched on to the end of the video, which is when Mr. Bernard realized he was being recorded by the apartment manager or employee or whatever it is he was. He was an employee of the apartment complex. And he goes ballistic, dropping a bunch of F-bombs, racial epithets, threatening to kill the person. The police had to restrain him against the wall, and said, don't do this. Francis, you're going to make it worse, I think was one of the lines in there. And then the video stops.
And making death threats right in front of police officers. Right. I mean, I can see how that could be, controversial and just not very smart. But that's not the point of the video, right?
From our perspective, it's not.
Yeah, I mean, having an extreme reaction like that, I would be offended if somebody were recording me without my knowledge as well. So I really don't blame him. Regardless of actually issuing death threats.
Well, but let me say this. Look, up to that point of the death threats, from an outsider's perspective, somebody that's not looking at this, thinking about the honor code or even thinking about the Mormon connection, you really don't have anything controversial. You've got a college student who was having a good time and got a little loud, and the police had to come.
So what?
Yeah.
Right?
Now the threats and stuff, I agree with you that in the heat of the moment, I think it's a very forgivable act on his part, assuming he's not going around doing this on a regular basis, which I have no reason to believe that he does. I do think that it was a pretty natural reaction, and I'm sure that given the opportunity, I'm sure he probably would apologize and express his regret for having done that. But so yeah, I mean, for us, we were not releasing it so everybody could listen to him, drop these F-bombs and, and call this guy an N-word. That's not why we released the video.
You released it to spark up a conversation about a police officer saying, "What about the honor code?" Right?
That's part of it, for sure.
When you have, the police force in BYU, which are incredibly notorious for just being the church enforcers, essentially, but unofficially, of course, you kind of run into a little bit of an entanglement with church and state when you have a police officer that's saying, hey, you can't do something because of the BYU honor code.
Okay.
That officer should have absolutely no regard for what the honor code says for what this kid was doing. For having disorderly conduct, for being too loud, for having people over, later than is reasonable and making too much noise. That's a police issue to take care of. I think that's probably a good idea, and that just happens. But invoking the ecclesiastical authority saying, what about the honor code? I think that's where this really becomes an issue.
Well, and it kind of, there's another layer to what you're saying, because I don't know if you recall, but when the Salt Lake Tribune did their massive reporting on the honor code and victims of sex abuse, for which they won a Pulitzer Prize, one of the things that they uncovered in that investigation and was reported on through the Tribune was that the Provo Police Department was regularly turning people over to the Honor Code office, including victims of sexual assault who may have been out after curfew or drinking at the time of their sexual assault. And that was one of the big issues in that reporting, was that, like you said, you've got this government entity who happens to be, the school happens to be within their jurisdiction, but at the same time, there's not really a formal connection there, and at least there shouldn't be. And they seem to be sort of, crossing the line and almost, some could argue acting as, agents of the school to a certain extent. And, even if the school hasn't necessarily asked them to, maybe they're taking it upon themselves because they feel like, maybe they're Mormon too. The police officer's a Mormon too. Maybe he's even like a BYU football fan, and he's looking at, who knows, like, what exactly is like going through his mind there. But at the end of the day, like you said, the police are responding to a nuisance call, and that really should be all they were dealing with.
Let's go on that for just, jump on that train for a second here, because I think we do see a fair amount of evidence that there was preferential treatment given to this Francis kid. Because he's on the BYU football team.
Which is the other part of it. Yep.
The police are likely fans, or the cops that were there anywhere are likely BYU fans, and they obviously didn't want to see his career hurt or anything. I did recently watched a highlight reel in preparation for this today of his, some of his greatest achievements in football, and he's a hell of a player. Like, don't get me wrong. But I also don't agree that just because somebody can throw a pigskin really well or be a great linebacker like he is, that they should gain preferential treatment over a standard student who is just, going through the daily grind of studying and passing tests to get their degree. And that's one of the primary issues of this, right? This kid obviously this isn't the first time that something like this has happened. And obviously, it's fair to assume that he's had a run-in or two with the honor code prior to this. It didn't sound like he grew up in Utah or anything to that effect.
Well, actually, he did.
He did?
Yeah, he's
interesting.
Yeah, I know. Okay. Well, that's you actually just touched on an important part, because for those that haven't watched the video, he says at one point to the police officer that he should be given slack because he grew up in a home that none of his family knew right from wrong. Now, okay. My opinion is that, he's throwing his family under the bus there unfairly. I doubt that's the family he grew up in. He's of Polynesian, he's Polynesian. I believe he was born in the United States, but his parents are Polynesian, and he's from Harriman, Utah, and he went to Harriman High School, and he served a mission in the Atlanta, Georgia mission. So, I'm just going to go out on a limb here and say that his parents are probably not the worst people in the world, like he made them sound like in the video. I think he might have been, inflating that a little bit just for the, for the moment,
That's fair.
Maybe I could be wrong. Maybe his parents are horrible people. I don't know, but I'm going to guess, err on the side that he was probably, inflating the situation a little bit in the moment.
Yeah, and no, I don't really blame him too. It sounds like he was trying to get out of $1,000 ticket. So that's incredibly understandable. So let's kind of talk about how it has been received. I mean, you released this a couple weeks ago now. Sure. I know that the internet has kind of had a bit of time to mull it over and have the blog discussions. I know you went on Mormon Stories episode, I believe it was 788. Yeah, 788, okay. With a couple of other guests to discuss that, and I will recommend everybody goes over and listens to that. If you don't listen to Mormon Stories already, listen to this episode because you guys do a really good deep dive and spend a lot of time on it, and I don't want to rehash everything. Right. But I want to ask you, Ryan, kind of what is the conversation that you wanted to start with this, and has that conversation been going on, and how have people kind of received it ever since? Right,
so we talked about part of the conversation, which is revolving around the police getting a little bit too involved in the process. But the main conversation you did kind of touch on a little bit is the fact that if you're a student athlete, you're going to get preferential treatment. And, just sort of, the 2 or 3 line, statement on that. And then, like you said, we really dive into this in the Mormon Stories interview, which I agree was really turned out really nice. You've got this guy who has had multiple interactions with the police, since he's been on the football team. And he was suspended, from the bowl game last year, which was after the incident that's on our video. So, kind of probably had something to do with that. And then he was unexpectedly, this isn't something that was announced back when he was suspended from the bowl game. He was on the team. Everything was fine. And about 5 or 6 days before we received this video, it was reported in the newspaper that he was going to be redshirting for personal reasons, and the school was not going to comment on what those personal reasons were. And there was an article that I read where they interviewed his older brother, who I guess was a star player at the University of Utah, who's since, graduated, I guess. And his brother told the paper that Francis Bernard was looking to possibly transfer, and that his redshirting had to do with difficulties with the honor code. But according to him, the school refused to tell him exactly what he violated the honor code. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, because I seriously doubt that.
I mean, if you're violating the honor code, know that you're violating it.
Yeah, I think the brother probably just didn't want to say.
Right.
But so he's probably had some other interactions since last December, whatever. Now, again, I don't think he's really probably done anything other than just normal college behavior, which would be, drinking and staying out with girls late at night or something.
And so what?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so what, right?
That's only an issue because the honor code makes it an issue.
Right. But here's the thing. If a regular student is engaging in these kinds of things or other kinds of things that are in violation of the honor code, compared to what happens to them, he got a pretty good deal because he's got to sit out this year, but keep in mind, he's redshirting. He's not suspended for the year.
Right.
So he doesn't even lose his eligibility. Yeah, he loses like the age, like if he's trying to go to the NFL, obviously he's 1 year older or whatever, but he's still going to get to play the amount of years that every college player will get to play. So it wasn't really a suspension, and he's enrolled in class.
Exactly. So, and the central point of what you're getting at is he's not getting expelled, whereas people who are not BYU football stars who violate the BYU honor code frequently do get expelled and are set back in their education or have to reapply or whatever the case is. So it's obvious this is blatant preferential treatment of somebody just because they are an athlete.
Yeah, and think about let's set aside for a second what punishment people receive for drinking and having sex outside of marriage, because I'm sure there's a lot of variation there, as there was with him. But just think about somebody who's a BYU student, and the only thing they do, they follow every rule of the honor code, except they stop believing in the LDS church and they admit it. They don't keep it a secret. They are automatically expelled from the school.
Yeah.
And so when you look at that and you compare it to, what happens with the football players or whatever, like I said before in the interview with DeLynn, and like I'm saying now, I don't think the guy did anything I don't even think he deserves to have to redshirt for a year. But at the end of the day, this is BYU, and they supposedly hold themselves to a higher standard. One thing I wanted to say that I didn't really get a chance to dive into in the DeLynn interview in regards to this is everybody's saying, well, what was the purpose? Why do you do this? What are you trying to do? We want there to be a change here in the honor code. And one thing I did say with DeLynn is I said, look, there needs to be some sort of way to make it more equitable, the way they enforce the honor code. And one of the problems is that BYU really rarely actually deals with the honor code themselves. What usually happens for regular students in most cases is that they confess some sort of sin to their bishop at home. That's not even at BYU, but he's the bishop that's giving them their ecclesiastical endorsement. And the bishop either says, okay, I feel like you're repentant enough. You can go ahead. I'll sign your thing. Or, you know what? I'm not going to sign your thing. And now you're kicked out of BYU. And so the honor code ends up being at the mercy of what's often referred to as leadership roulette. And so one student, right. one student could go home for the summer and confess to having sex outside of marriage to their bishop. And that bishop could say, I feel like you're repentant. This shouldn't ruin your college career. Just make sure you don't do it again. And come back and see me next year, blah, blah, blah. Here's your form. And another student could come to another bishop and confess the exact same thing. And that bishop could say, you must repent. You cannot enter. You aren't even worthy to step on that campus. And I will not sign your thing. And so, there's that inequity there. And it's demonstrated in the way that this football player got off pretty easy compared to what other students do. And so all we don't want Francis Bernard to get into trouble for what he did. And we also don't want other people who are just living normal lives to get in trouble for what they're doing. The only thing I think he should get in trouble for, if anything, would be like the threats he made at the end of the video. And even at that, I think a public apology and a 1 or 2 game suspension would be more than enough for that.
Okay. I would agree with that. So kind of in your mind then, I'm asking Ryan McKnight here. I'm not asking of Mormon Leaks' opinion on this. Just on a personal level, then, would you prefer to just see an abolishment of the honor code, broad spectrum, or do you want to see it, changed and have allowances made for drinking alcohol for some people? Or, what is it that you would like to happen just on a personal level here?
Well, in a perfect world, I suppose, the full abolishment, but I don't know how realistic that is. I think what they could do is, in the short term, before they wake up and realize that they need to get rid of the whole thing, what they need to do, I think, is come up with some really specific guidelines for the various violations and say, let's take alcohol, for example, and say, if somebody gets busted for alcohol, they get a verbal warning, then a written warning, then a second written warning, then they finally get kicked out, or whatever it is. Like explain, and then say this, these steps apply to everybody across the board.
Right. It's not just the athletes that get the warnings. Everybody gets 3 warnings and then they're out, right? Yeah,
because right now it's just you can't drink alcohol. That's it.
Yeah.
Well, what does that mean? You know what I mean? I mean, because obviously people are going to make mistakes or whatever. So I think one good step would be to outline, if they're going to keep this ridiculous honor code, is going to be to outline the punishment process, and then let all bishops that are signing these ecclesiastical forms, and then of course the internal people that would deal with football players and things like that, to make sure that they're following these things. But one of the things that Darren, and I'm having a brain fart on what his last name is, but the doctor, is it Smith? Is it Darren Smith?
I'm looking at it right now. Darren Smith, yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Darren Smith, who was on that podcast with me with Mormon Stories, and he's studied extensively things revolving around football players or student athletes and honor code violations and things like this. He talked about how the honor code, you've got all these Mormons going to BYU who have already, through baptism and through going to the temple and whatever it is they've done in church, have already made promises to follow the gospel. And here now they have to sign a document basically saying again that they're going to follow the gospel.
Right.
You know, at some point, I mean, are we going to treat these people like adults and allow them to make their own choices and let the consequences follow, like so many of us have been taught? Or are they going to continue to live in this sort of, dictatorship state, this martial law that they live under, where everybody's sort of, you got to have speakeasies and stuff in order to not even for like activities, but even just to have conversations, you've got to make sure that, everybody's, sign some sort of blood oath before you can even start talking about the fact
have
that
like
Joseph
an
Smith
underground Masonic league inside BYU where they talk about church apostasy.
Yeah, right. So, I'm confident that eventually they'll come out of this Stone Age because, it only hurts them every day from their public relations standpoint.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's how all change happens in the church. Eventually that public relations disaster will reach some sort of a crescendo where they'll have to dial it back somehow. But until then, I do hope they find a way to more equitably apply the honor code. And I would say, as far as Mr. Bernard here in his specific case, I mean, a lot of the accusations out there that we were trying to ruin his life or that we are going to ruin his life. And I just don't really buy into that. I don't think it was that bad what happened. It's a little of an embarrassment, but I would say any school that was interested in him for transfer purposes, if this video makes them not interested in him anymore, then that's on that school, not on us or him. Because, we are a country of second chances and he hasn't done anything that is beyond being deserving a second chance.
Oh, yeah.
And, so I my advice to him is to transfer as quick as possible. I know at the LSU game, I know he was on the sideline at the LSU game with headset on. So, I mean, at least up to that game, he was still, part of the team or whatever. But I hope, and that was, for those that aren't necessarily paying attention to BYU football, that game was after the video was released. But, I say to him, get yourself outside of under the thumb of the honor code, go transfer to University of Utah or whatever school, or if you want to come down here to Las Vegas to UNLV, we could definitely use you. We have a struggling team that we could use some good players on, and, live the rest of your football career out, wherever it takes you, and, free of the oppression of that honor code. That's my message to him. Turn this into a positive.
Yeah, exactly. And I just kind of want to round this out by saying this video was not about Francis Bernard. This video was about the police and BYU and the honor code. It had nothing to do with the football player, even though he was kind of the featured guest of it. So I think that's kind of important to focus on, keep our focus on the actual important matter of the video and not on, what we might qualify as mistakes that Francis himself may have made.
And BYU fans obviously have not been able to do that at all. You asked about the reaction online. It's been mixed among ex-Mormons. A lot of ex-Mormons had the concern about, are we doing this for the right reasons and whatnot? And I think the Mormon Stories interview, calmed a lot of that down. But, the BYU fans, if anybody wants to go and look at our Twitter, from that time, it's absolutely nuts. The people they went berserk. Some of the most ridiculous things, anywhere from, there were even people, cause their game that was a couple days after that video was against LSU, which they got blown out, right? And I think they lost like 28-0 or something like that.
Wow.
There were even people blaming that on us for distracting the team. And it's like, well, wait a second. I mean, wasn't the team already struggling? I mean, didn't they barely beat the previous opponent?
Wow.
And here they go up against, so people were just, you should see, let's just say their Mormonism went out the door and any word, any foul language was all on the table. They were able to say whatever it is, nasty thing they want to say to us, just basically in defense of their beloved football program, I guess.
Yeah, right.
The joke's on them though, because I just sat around laughing at the whole thing.
Right.
I think a lot of them were trying to, me and the Mormon Leaks team, we kept sending each other screenshots of different tweets we saw and having a real good laugh about it because, man, they took it real seriously.
Well, I think one of the primary takeaways of this entire conversation is the fact that sports fans don't really have a problem making certain exceptions in extenuating circumstances. But
for their team.
Yeah, for their team, exactly. So I do actually want to wrap up this conversation by just adding one extra point that that kind of occurred to me recently here. I do have kind of a foundational issue personally with the honor code because it gives an air of discipline where discipline may not exist in some case. So I know that when you were on the Mormon Stories episode, somebody was talking about the police referring people to their school counselors and to the honor code in order for their punishment of some sort. And that can be a wide range of actual honor code violations to small misdemeanor infractions. But when you are disciplined by the honor code, you're not being disciplined by the police or something. So let's just say in a crazy off the wall scenario that this might happen. Let's say that a woman gets sexually assaulted on campus, on BYU campus, and she goes to the police, and the police they file a report, and then they send it to the honor code office to talk to the person that committed this sexual assault. At that point, the BYU office has a chance that they can expel this person, which they rightfully should, and also have them legally prosecuted. Or they can say, well, you are in violation of the honor code for this and this and this reason. It turns out she was also in honor code violation because she was drinking at the time and she was out past curfew or whatever the case is. So it allows almost a scapegoat for people where they should be punished otherwise through the law, where the police can go through this honor code authority essentially, and it's seen as good enough of a punishment. If you're punished for honor code violations, it's like, oh, my world is falling down. Well, when a woman gets sexually assaulted, the assaulter should undergo legal prosecution and should bear the consequences of their actions. And I think the honor code leaves a gigantic loophole for people that do that. So that's one of my foundational issues with the honor code.
Now, if we want to be slightly fair, to BYU here, they claim that they have made changes so that what happened to these victims of sexual assault does not happen to anybody else in the future. They do claim, like within the last couple of months, that they've made those changes so that basically
Ryan, that is just milquetoast to me. That is absolutely nothing until they publish out their hard guidelines and we see an uptick in actual convictions and prosecutions for sexual assault on BYU campus. I don't think the numbers and the statistics actually play out that they have significantly changed their procedures.
Sure, I'm with you on that. We'll see if they've actually made their changes or not. I don't know. They claim they have.
Fair enough. Good note to wrap that one up on. Ryan, thank you for coming on as our Mormon Leaks correspondent for our Mormon Leaks Hour for today.
Yeah.
And, of course, there will be links to mormonleaks.io in the show notes if people want to chase this down. So, Ryan, thanks for coming on, man. It's been a pleasure.
No problem.
All right, that's pretty much going to do it. Of course, I always want to thank our recurring correspondent, Ryan McKnight, for coming onto the show to talk about the Mormon leaks that have recently come out. Now, we are a few weeks out to a conference, and he has typically in the past done large jumps the week prior to conference. So we'll have him on probably the week after conference, and we'll really discuss some of the richer leaks that have come out at that time. There was one thing that I needed to discuss on the show here, and it came in the form of an email from Anonymous. And I'm going to read the email in its entirety, and it's a response to the child abuse segment of Mormon Leaks Minute that Ryan and I did. And that was back on episode 64. To lay the groundwork for anyone who hasn't heard that, a woman named Deb Diner, I believe that's how you pronounce her name, put together and published this 316-page document about instances of child sex abuse by members of the LDS Church. And the majority of these are well substantiated by court documents or by newspaper extracts and whatnot. Granted, there are some that are merely allegations, but the majority of them are convictions. She did, however, Deb Diner, in the opening few paragraphs, did make the point that this is by no means a comprehensive list. This is just barely scratching the surface. So this was Anonymous's reply or response email that Anonymous penned to me in response to a couple of things that I said. And I'm just going to read the email and then discuss kind of my thoughts about this. Anonymous said, quote, "I was very disappointed the other day with your attitude toward how the church should handle accusations of sexual abuse. I have volunteered for years with victims of sexual assault, and while it is important that people believe and support them, you advocated for the church to publish details of accusations with no regard for due process or proof. This is irresponsible and life-shattering for victims of false accusations, and you should be apologizing for promoting it. Do you know how many teachers get falsely accused of sexual abuse every year? Their lives are ruined whether or not their names are cleared. Sex offender registries are a legal punishment for those found guilty of an offense. And no matter how bad it makes you feel, it's wrong to put people's names out without guilt established in a court of law. I think you let your feelings for the church cloud your judgment, and I hope you choose to publish a retraction." End quote. Let me just say, I'm glad this email came in because it forced me to go back and give the segment another listen in order to prepare a response and try and articulate my position a little better instead of just speaking off of the cuff as I did when the segment first aired. I think the main point where Anonymous took issue with what I said is when I claimed that when allegations of child sex abuse come up, that should go on a person's church record, and when a bishop attempts to call that person to a leadership position where they deal with children, there should be an error message that pops up on their computer. And I went on to further state that members of the community should be aware when a single person is accused of sex abuse, and the information should be publicly available so people can protect their children. Now, what I should have done there is I should have substituted accusation with conviction. So let me restate it with how I probably should have said it, but then let me go on to further qualify what I truly mean. When a person is convicted of child sex abuse, their name should be available on a public registry, and an error message should pop up on the bishop's computer screen when he tries to call them to a leadership position over children. Additionally, members of the community should also be made aware so that they can keep their children safe, even if the bishop happens to overlook that person's record with child abuse. So that's a restating. Had I said convicted of sex abuse instead of accusations of sex abuse, I don't think that Anonymous would have taken issue with what I said, because that's kind of the whole reason that the sex offender registry exists. I don't think that a person's life should be ruined if somebody accuses them of sex abuse. But their life should definitely change if they're convicted of child sex abuse. However, nuance exists in this, so let me further qualify what I mean. It's a well-studied fact that the majority of sex offenses, especially when it comes to children, go unreported. If Anonymous does indeed work with sexual assault victims, as Anonymous claimed, they would understand how rampant the problem is when it comes to underreporting and lack of prosecuting people when a sexual assault occurs. Now, I understand that when false allegations arise of a person committing said atrocity, that it can ruin their lives in many ways. But being raped also ruins a lot of people's lives. And more people are actually raped where the perpetrator goes unpunished than there are false allegations of sexual assault that ruin a person's life. You know, a false positive when it comes to sexual allegations can devastate a person's life. And, you know, if I can try to empathize with what that's like, I can't imagine how terrible it would be. That would be shattering to be accused of sexual assault at any level when it hadn't happened. But there are a lot more false negatives when it comes to actual sex assault happening. And I prefer to err on the side of caution when somebody says that they were touched inappropriately or whatever the case may be. So let me try and be as crystal clear as possible with what I envision as a few small fixes which may make the problem slightly better, as I am coming at this from a perspective of somebody who never deals with this, has no experience with sexual assault victims, and am completely ignorant to much of the nuance of this issue. So take my opinion for what it's worth. All ecclesiastical officials at any capacity should be mandatory reporters in all states. Utah shouldn't be exempt from that law as they are right now. The hotline that the church uses for sex abuse cases shouldn't go to an internal committee. It should be an outside law enforcement watchdog committee. The church policing itself on this issue is obviously woefully inadequate. And then, of course, Ryan's suggestion of publishing the dollar amount paid out to settle sex abuse cases by the church, that would be a wonderful statistic to see, because members wouldn't know the details of the case. They wouldn't know where it happened or the names of the people or whatever, but they would know that X number millions of dollars of their tithing goes to settling sex abuse cases every year. I would think that would cause some problems with believing members. Also, women in church authority positions would curtail the problem at a systematic level. I think that would be one great way to help ameliorate these problems. Now, these are some very small fixes that could only help make the situation better handled and slightly more transparent. I don't think people who are accused of sex abuse should be doxxed like the sex offender registry does unless they are convicted of sex abuse in the court of law. But unfortunately, that lets a lot of people slip through the cracks, where the majority of cases go unprosecuted or come down to, he said and she said without any legitimate evidence to prosecute the offender. And I don't have a solution to that. Unfortunately for us all, oftentimes the only way a repeat offender is prosecuted is when a number of disconnected allegations arise to the point that they can't all be fabrications or coincidence. But by the time a conviction comes down on those people, they've done too much damage long before anything is ever done about it. So like I said, I like to err on the side of caution when it comes to sex abuse. But I'm also all for keeping people's identity secret and not having people have their lives ruined when somebody accuses them of sex abuse. So that's my prepared response to Anonymous's email. I'm not retracting my statements as Anonymous asked, so much as I'm correcting some very small word choices and trying to clarify my position. So I eagerly await another email if you take issue with anything I've said in this correction here, Anonymous. But all in all, thank you for sending in that email. That was all the listener feedback to get to. If you want to contact me, talk to me directly, you can do so at nakedmormonism@gmail.com. If you have anything you want to talk about, any corrections you want to send in, or if you just want to, have some correspondence back and forth, that's the best way to reach me. And to those of you who have recently sent in emails, please keep doing so. It's really a lot of fun to talk to you. With that, we have a couple of new patrons to thank. One new patron and a couple of pledge edits. So we have a new patron, a new name, Joanna. Wonder if that's any relation to a new name, Noah. Little beard scratch. Also, we have pledge edits from Lynn, David, and Fee54Fana. That's a delightful name. So thank you all very much for your supports and your pledge edits, and for keeping the lights on here at Ground Gnome Studios. It's really nice of you. Just a heads up for everybody, all of those amazing patron supporters, you've made it possible for me to attend a couple of conferences that are coming up really soon. I've mentioned this in the past, and I just want to reiterate it before hopping in my car to drive down there. On September 21st through 24th, we have the John Whitmer History Association conference that is just a total Mormon history nerd conference. It's like Sunstone, only much more focused on just history, so I'm stoked to be going to that. And the author, William Morain, of the book from which I read quite a bit from, the Sword of Laban today, he is going to be attending as well, so I hope to talk to him. Maybe, just maybe, we can get him on the show. We'll have to see. But I'm going to do everything in my power. But that being said, this conference is going to generate a ton of material and a ton of information in my mind to bring back to the podcast, and it would not be possible for me to do that unless the patron supporters were funding this. So thank you all so much for doing so. Also, I will be September 30th going to the Mythicist Milwaukee Conference. They have some amazing debates planned out. They also have a bunch of special guests that I'm really stoked to see there. So you can check the show notes for the links to the Mythicist Milwaukee Conference. And if you are near Milwaukee or can get there by September 30th, I highly recommend it. It's going to be a really good time. And the hangout at the hotel after the conference is where the real fun happens. So That's what I needed to just quickly announce. Also, for patron supporters, this episode is not extended. However, you are getting a special episode that is the next episode of reading through An Address to All Believers in Christ by David Whitmer, D-Day David Whitmer as we know him. And the reason that I'm doing this is because the people who support on Patreon, they are obviously the people who want to see this work furthered, or else they wouldn't be supporting monetarily. So this is what I'm offering to you in exchange. I'm reading through these documents for the first time myself, and these are frequently old school Mormon documents that even a lot of Mormon historians don't actually read through themselves. A lot of historians will read through books that cite, An Address to All Believers in Christ, or Remarkable Visions, or all of these various missionary tracts and pamphlets, but oftentimes they don't take the time to read it themselves. So what I'm doing is giving the patron supporters a leg up on other Mormon historians, and they can speak hopefully at a knowledgeable level about these things after they consume that audio and consume those pamphlets in audio format with my commentary added. So when you're talking to somebody about the first witnesses of the church, David Whitmer and the other Whitmers and their important contributions to the church, and they start talking about how maybe, David Whitmer, he kind of apostatized in 1838, he had some problems with the church, so he left. You can say, I listened to, or I read his memoir that was An Address to All Believers in Christ and An Address to All Believers in the Book of Mormon. And, he actually says some very interesting things and lends us into a unique perspective of Joseph Smith and the authorship of the Book of Mormon. Did you know that he said this and this and this and this? Did you know that he is actually a crazy Christian zealot who thought that Joseph Smith had departed away from being a prophet when he decided to found the church in 1830? And prior to that, then David Whitmer only thought that Joseph Smith was called as a prophet to reveal the Book of Mormon, and that was the complete fulfillment of his calling? Yeah, you can have some interesting, deeper conversations once you understand the content of these early Mormon writings. So that is what the patrons get, very special to just them. If you want to join the ranks and listen to all of that extra content, there is usually an extra episode per week generated, or just extra content tacked onto episodes. You can get there at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, patreon.com/nakedmormonism. Thank you so much. Let's shut it down for the evening. I do need to thank a few other people who make things go on the back end and keep the wheels turning of this somewhat oiled, clunky machine. First off, I want to thank Julie for posting up on the Twitter and Facebook pages and corresponding there. She really keeps the conversation going. Thank you for doing that. I need to thank Jason Camo for providing the music going into your ear hole right now. Go to aloststateofmind.com to get more of his music there. Craig Keeling provided the artwork used in this show with his permission. Go to weirdmormonshit.com to check out his blog there. Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres and co-host of the Opening Arguments podcast is the legal counsel for this show. He makes sure that we do everything on the up and up. Thank you, Andrew. Once again, thanks to all the patrons who support the show at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. You keep my face buried in these books day in and day out. Thank you. And of course, this show would be nothing if not for the people who download it. So to all of you out there commuting, exercising, playing video games, doing whatever you're doing in order to consume your podcasts, thank you so much once again for lending me your ear. I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2017, all rights reserved.